Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the pleasure of serving as director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. As some of you may know, last year Shelby gave us $10 million to our endowment fund, plus another $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you care to drop $1 million on us, the Leon Levy Foundation would match it with another $1 million, and we'd name one of the 4 fellowships after you. Now, I hear some titters. You may think this is improbable, but let me reveal that it has already happened. It is not official yet, so I am not allowed to name the donor, but I can say that the mystery man is sitting quite modestly among us tonight. And in a nice coincidence, since tonight's event is devoted to a discussion of James Baldwin, I can add that this particular fellowship will be devoted to biographers writing about figures from the Africa diaspora. So that's my pitch for the evening. Please note that our next event will be on Thursday, December 4th, when the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Megan Marshall will be in conversation with Martha Hodes about the art of biography. Please mark your calendars, and if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our handsome new website so that you can be notified of our future events. But tonight I'm delighted to be here this evening to introduce my friend Nicholas Boggs, who is here to discuss his stunning new biography of James Baldwin. He will be in conversation with the esteemed John McWhorter. Nick Boggs earned a BA from Yale and a PhD from Columbia University. He is co-editor of the 2018 edition of James Baldwin's collaboration with the French artist Yoran Kazak, Little Man, A Story of Childhood. He received the 2019 Robert and Ina Caro Travel and Research Fellowship from the Biographers International Organization. He won a Whiting Fellowship in Creative Nonfiction in 2023 and a Leon Levy Biography Fellowship in 2020. He also won fellowships from the Schomburg Center, the NEH, as well as residencies in Yaddo and MacDowell. Obviously, he's very apt at writing proposals.
Unemployed.
His writings have appeared in anthologies such as James Baldwin Now and the Cambridge Companion to James Baldwin. His new book, James Baldwin, is, however, his very first biography. John Hamilton McWhorter V is a professor of linguistics at Columbia University, where he also teaches American Studies and music history. He has authored a number of books on race relations and African American culture, and he currently writes a must-read column in the New York Times on linguistics. On a personal note, I'd like to explain that Nick Boggs was a fellow at the Leon Levy Center in 2020-21, the year of the great pandemic. As a result, this cohort of 5 working biographers only met to discuss their work over Zoom. This was a great disappointment. On the other hand, the pandemic year forged a particularly close bond for these biographers, and they all became extremely productive. In an extraordinary feat, all 5 of them have completed their books this very year. And it is an extraordinary collection, and I want to mention their names. Susan Morrison on Lauren Michaels, Lance Richardson on Peter Matheson, Francesca Wade on Gertrude Stein, and now Nicholas Boggs on James Baldwin. And finally, next spring, Miriam Horn, who is here with us tonight, is publishing a great doorstopper of a biography on the naturalist and explorer George Schaller. They are all to be warmly congratulated. It's so hard to write a biography, and some of them take 5 years, some of them take 10. My first biography took 10 years. It's a labor of love. Anyway, Nick and John will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our in-person audience. This session is being live streamed. At the end of the evening, Nick Boggs will be signing books out in the lobby. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. I now turn over the conversation to John McWhorter.
Thank you, Kai. Nick, I want to start here. This book was absolutely luscious. I would come home every night itching to get into what I call my bourbon chair and finish this wonderful, large, but wonderful book. Absolutely splendid job. But you know what? It left me, I thought I kind of knew Baldwin. I had him down. Your book left me with more questions than answers in some ways, and I'm honored to be able to actually just sit here and ask you. And so, one of them, and this is going to seem kind of naive, but really, I really need help on this. Here is the epitaph, and so, love is the only reality, the only terror, and the only hope. That. A lot of love with James Baldwin, that's the big theme. What does that epitaph mean? I really don't know what it means. I think the words are pretty, but can you break that down a little for me?
So I'm going to stall answering that question for a second while I think about it by just thanking the Leon Levy Center for Biography, thanking Shelby White, thanking Kai Bird, and who really pushed us to keep doing our footnotes, which was amazing, and my fellow biographers, also Judith Thurman, who's here tonight, and my partner, Marlon, and just thank you, everybody. There are other people I'll probably mention in the conversation. I love all these people, so I guess that's the answer?
Right,
no.
yeah.
No, I chose that epigraph because it's actually a letter he wrote to somebody not that consequential that I found in the Schwartzman building. Love is the only reality, love is the only terror, love is the only hope. Because all of his writing is about love, right? Even though there's this sort of vision of him as this civil rights icon, this orator, in fact, all of his novels are love stories. Even his political writings are really rooted in the idea that black and white Americans must come together like lovers, he says, in order to make freedom real. And so, but I think that quote encompasses all the parts of him. We'll start with the hope. He definitely found hope in love. He also was terrified by it. He was terrified by his own project of self-love, which he felt menaced by sort of phobias around race and sexuality. So that's part of the terror. And the reality is just that the whole world, that was his reality. His world was spent constructing these alternative kinship structures and love relationships that had been looked at before, but not with the kind of microscope that I hope to bring to his life.
Yeah, what you did with the microscope was invaluable, but to tell you the truth, I always took from that spate of 90s biographies of him that his life had been a kind of a victory that ended on the soon side. There were pitfalls, but I always thought of it as if it were a musical, it would end with something in a major key is what I thought. This is one of the saddest books I have ever read. And what I mean is that I didn't know, because in the 90s they weren't positioned to really explain it as clearly as you have, that basically you talk about him having 4 great loves, and it starts with Beaufort Delaney, but in terms of loves as in who he loved back, all 3 of them were predominantly straight men who married and usually had kids, and he had 3 of these in a row, and that was his love life. That was who he loved most, and it could never really work out, and he never got past it. And I found myself thinking, wow, that is really hard. Do you have a sense, from having actually met these people, why he kept running up against that instead of living out his life with a Beaufort Delaney who was closer to his age and probably his color, and where the love was mutual? What was he running up against?
That's a great question, and it's one that dogged me, not throughout the process of of writing the book, but throughout the process of researching it, I think that's something that was really hard for me to understand. I did understand that it was a big part of his creative process, that this yearning for a kind of lost love object or lost ideal was very similar to the kind of impossible love that he had for America, that he had to run away from and constantly come back to and reconnect with. But I did have a moment in terms of that explicit question that was kind of a lightning bolt moment. So yoran Kazak was his final great love, who was married. Baldwin became godfather to his children. I met yoran Kazak. I can tell that story later.
And you found him,
I
which
found
is a great
him,
story.
which is a whole, which is really how this book began in the early 2000s. But when I finally worked up the courage to ask him with my translator there, because my French was not good enough, and it was a very subtle question. How do you talk about this in a way that's not invasive or salacious? But I really wanted to know what made their relationship tick. And there were two things that happened that let me figure that out, sort of. And the first one is that I asked him, I said, well, it seems that James Baldwin wanted to have a long-term domestic relationship with you. He spoke about your relationship as a marriage, in fact, in some of his letters to his brother David. And I expected him to answer me in a serious or somber way, and he burst out laughing. I'm in his studio in Montmartre, and he burst out laughing, and I did not know how to respond, but he was laughing because he said, Jimmy may have said that he wanted that. He may have believed that he wanted that. But in fact, he was utterly incapable of that. He was married to his writing. He was married to his art. And that's one of the reasons that he sought out these relationships where he could still have this intense connection and then go away, write, and come back. And it infused the plots of his writing. But it was a shocking moment for me. I did not expect laughter. But it did explain to me, finally, that piece of the puzzle.
All right, wait. You're going to know this better than, at this point, almost anybody. One version of James Baldwin is there's this delightful photograph of him and Lorraine Hansberry in her living room, drinking and smoking and dancing. One of them, I forget whether it's her or him, has their arms out like they're an airplane. They're clearly having a great time. That is Happy Jimmy.
That's actually not Lorraine Hansberry. I know that's a common, it's often misidentified that way. It's a core, a woman who works for CORE there in the South.
Are you sure?
I'm serious, yeah.
Because I love that picture because it's those two people.
There are other good ones of
Not
them.
her?
A lot of people think that. It's a common misconception.
It's like that picture of Zora Neale Hurston that really looks more like Florence from the Jeffersons. It's a different woman. I'm gonna look when I go home. But anyway, you know as well as I do that they did used to hang out and drink together and have a good time. And that's Jimmy. But then, is that the real person? Or really, did he finish out his life as this melancholy person who never quite rang the bell? Or is it really both people at the same time?
Well, I'm glad you brought up Lorraine Hansberry because I think one thing we have to remember is how unconventional his life was. I mean, he had these impossible relationships with men, and then he had these incredibly close relationships with men, but also with women, like Lorraine Hansberry, like Mary Painter, who he wrote these extraordinary letters to. This was a white American woman in Paris who became his best friend, like Maya Angelou, Nina Simone as well. So he had a very, very, I'm sad that you're sad because my goal in this book was actually to show how much joy and kinship and communion and love he had in his life. I actually think it was incredibly rich because it wasn't, we don't look at like somebody's life and if they were married and to a man and a woman, and then they get divorced. We're like, and then they never marry again. Oh gosh, what a sad life. People just say, oh, they got married. Yeah. I think Baldwin had an incredibly rich, erotic, effective, relationship life with all kinds of people often say, oh, Baldwin, he wasn't handsome or something. I'm like, have you seen what his lovers looked like? I mean, he had some absolutely gorgeous lovers. So I actually wanted to show that this was a misconception that Baldwin's life, sure, it had suffering, it had difficulty, but actually it was incredibly alive with love and sex and pleasure and life.
Good. There is one thing I missed in your book, and it's only because you have the theme of the loves, and you wanted to get on with it. I fully get it. But I got the feeling you kind of rushed through the childhood or gave it to us in pieces. And you can get it from the other books. But I did find myself wondering, because I now read those books half my life ago, who did he hang out with? Not his family, but who did he hang out with in high school? So he has that thing that they write he writes in somebody's yearbook, fame is the spur, but ouch. And I always thought most of those boys were white, weren't they? Who were his running buddies when he was 16?
So that was from his junior high school. The fame is the spur, but ouch, which I love that quote because he did become famous and it did hurt.
It hurt, right.
But that was junior high school. And in junior high school, he was at a mostly African-American school in Harlem where Count Cullen, amazingly, was his teacher. And that was incredibly formative for him. And then when he went to high school at the magnet school, DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx, and that is where most of his classmates were Jewish. Richard Avedon, Sol Stein, Emil Kapuya, all these men became quite prominent figures in the arts or in publishing. So that's where he joined the school newspaper, Magpie. So as he's preaching, he's a preacher at this point, a child preacher, he's also being surrounded by these young men who are as fascinated and into art and culture as he is really inside of him. And that was a lot of his conflict, along with his sexuality during his teen years. So, but he also had a best friend from the neighborhood, Arthur Moore, who he was in love with, who became sort of the prototype for Elisha on Go Tell It on the Mountain. So he had an interracial group of friends, both in Harlem and elsewhere.
Okay, I would like you, Nick, to help me understand something else about Baldwin. And I'm going to do this modern thing where instead of having memorized it, I'm going to read it from my phone. So I want you guys to know that this is not me looking at texts or something, but I took a picture of a page. And this is a Baldwin statement. It's kind of typical of him. And to be honest, I've always pretended to understand it, but I don't really, any more than I fully understand the love part. And it's a certain point he makes that white people will not be complete or truly happy until they acknowledge their inner racism and how racism is the history of this country. And I've always kind of thought, really, and no offense to anybody here who's white, but I've often thought you are giving the ordinary person too much credit. I got the feeling that they feel pretty complete regardless of all of this. And yet, no offense, but I just always thought, you don't look incomplete to me. And so, this is the sort of thing I mean, and he writes about it so beautifully with these lapidary sentences. And so, white people who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it, are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. This is the place in which it seems to me most white Americans find themselves, impaled. They are dimly or vividly aware that the history they fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they don't know how to release themselves from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. This incoherence is heard nowhere more plainly than in those stammering, terrified dialogues which white Americans sometimes entertain with that black conscience, the black man in America. Great writing. He wrote that over and over again in lots of beautiful ways. Do you believe it? And I know that that's supposed to be one of the main Baldwin things, and I'm a huge admirer of him, but I've never really understood that point.
Do I believe that he believes it, or do I believe it?
That he believes it.
I believe that one of the fascinating things about writing about Baldwin for so many years and looking at all these archives is that he was really idiosyncratic, actually. And one thing I admired about him is that he was willing to change his mind about things. He changed his mind about gender, he changed his mind about Palestine, he changed his mind about the civil rights movement. He moved further to the left. So I think when you look at his writing, especially sentences like that, you have to understand that he is being an artist, which he was, but he's also being incredibly strategic, right? He is trying to convince white people to feel that way or to be, in order to move them to make social change. Whether he believes they in fact feel that way, I'm not sure, but he wants them to feel that way, because if they feel that way, then the Civil Rights Act can get passed.
Talk a little bit of, that sounds so NPR. Talk a little bit about the phase in the late 60s where Baldwin starts to fall out of style with a certain type. Why in the world would a genius full of love as he was, why would people start to hate on him? What happened?
Can't we stay on love? No, I'm kidding. So you're talking about later in the 60s, when he gets, sort of after the publication of Another Country. So as a novelist, some people were starting to say that he was a messy novelist. But a lot of the critiques were really ideological. He was no longer the darling of the white liberals, and he was also no longer saying, again, strategically or not, that black and white Americans needed to come together like lovers. He was now like, wait, Elijah Muhammad has some good points. Malcolm X has some very valid points. Martin Luther King is too centrist. So he was moving farther to the left, thanks to people like Lorraine Hansberry, in fact. So the critiques of him as an artist, I think, had some root in actually just in ideological differences with him. He was also just unwilling to be anybody's mouthpiece. Think about the March on Washington. So he is in Paris. He puts together a speech there for African Americans in Paris who are supporting the March on Washington. He comes back. He's supposed to read that speech, which is really about global black liberation. And they decide, the powers that be in the civil rights movement, that he can't read, whether it's because of his sexuality. As some say, I actually think Malcolm X had it right when he said they didn't want Baldwin to get up there because you can't control what he's going to say. Mm-hmm. So guess who they had get up there instead and read that speech? Burt Lancaster. So this is what he was dealing with. And you can find it on YouTube. It's one of the oddest things you'll ever see. Burt Lancaster not saying that he's reading Baldwin's words, getting up there, and the crowd does not understand why on earth these words are coming out of his mouth.
Birdman of Alcatraz is up there giving that speech. Yeah, what about Eldridge Cleaver? What was the issue there?
Repressed desires and homophobia. I mean, if you read closely Soul on Ice, where he says those nasty things that I won't say again, he starts by saying, when he started reading Baldwin early on, he lusted after his sentences. Oh, really, Eldridge? You lusted after Baldwin's sentences?
I never read it that way, but you're right, actually. Yeah. So you think it was partly just frustration at desires that he may have had?
Inability to have a kind of vulnerable interior life that Baldwin did have. So even when Baldwin, he came after Baldwin saying he hates himself, not just because he had homosexual desires, but because he wrote an essay early on about how his people hadn't created Shakespeare and how he was ashamed of that when he was younger. When he was younger. It's an essay about sort of moving through his consciousness as a young black man in a white-dominated world. So Eldridge had a problem with that. But that was actually a very vulnerable moment, a complex moment. And Baldwin's point wasn't that white culture trumps black culture. That was the opposite for him. He had to reconnect with Bessie Smith when he went to the Swiss Alps and wrote Gotthard on the Mountain. Baldwin was a great lover of black culture and black art and black people, so including Eldridge. Even though that hatefulness, Baldwin still wanted to be loved and accepted by Eldridge, and Eldridge still wanted Baldwin's money, which he gave him in the 70s when he was in St. Paul de Vence, and Eldridge was going through a lot of trouble at that point. That was before before the presidential bid and all that silly stuff.
Have you ever seen that documentary with James Baldwin and Bobby Short hanging out in France and doing the blues and everything? I haven't seen it since it came out. It must be on Netflix or up in the cloud somewhere, but it's a beautiful example of how there's no way that Baldwin thought black art wasn't as important or good or something.
I think that's The Price of the Ticket, which is that's the documentary that I think you're talking about.
About 94, 95?
89, Karen Thorson, great documentary, still the kind of standard bearer. I mean, Raoul Peck's documentary was important, but this one really tells most of his life story, although it doesn't have people like Buford Delaney in it, actually.
More naughty questions about Baldwin, who I have always been an admirer of whenever I'm writing, not whenever, but often when I'm writing, I'm always thinking my sentences will never be like his, for example, and I will never be considered wise. I'm just considered prolific, basically, and there's a difference. But the novels, the essays, and I'm not bragging, I just read a lot. I've read every essay, I've read most of the novels. I know that it's considered unfashionable in some circles to say that the novels are not quite at the height of the essays, but it's what I have always believed. I've always found the novels beautiful, but often somewhat of a stretch, and often mining the same territory. Am I a bad man? What do you think?
Well, for a long time, it was very fashionable to say exactly that he was a great essayist and just an okay novelist. And I still think that's fashionable in many circles.
But you don't think so. And I enjoyed your argument otherwise.
See, I don't know if I made an argument. I think I tried through the stories to tell his life story, and I also tried by looking at his creative process to show, in some ways, the question of essays versus novels is moot, because you can't understand either of them without reading the others. So, for example, you can't understand Another Country, right, all about these messy interracial relationships, if you don't read it with and against The Fire Next Time, where he's using that metaphor of the lovers.
You mean it doesn't stand on its own as just a found piece? You need to connect it to what it was surrounded by.
I think to understand its significance. I mean, I think Another Country is an incredibly significant novel historically. And aesthetic judgments are always going to be aesthetic judgments that change with time. But if we're looking at historical significance, The Fire Next Time and Another Country have to be seen together. Similarly, Giovanni's Room, historically significant. You have to read The Preservation of Innocence, right? And Male Prison, where he's writing about sort of the perniciousness of internalized homophobia, et cetera, white masculinity, and then he's exploring that in Giovanni's Room in all of these important ways. So as I wrote this book, this was something that I was really reminded of. It wasn't something I thought consciously beforehand, but I realized, oh, I don't even care at this point. I don't care which ones people think are better or not. If you think the essays are better and you want to understand the essays better, then you should read the novels. If you think the novels are better, but you want to understand them better, then you should read the essays. Or maybe you just love them all.
I remember reading Another Country. I was a little young, I was probably like 25 or something like that, and thinking, I enjoyed that, but I'm not sure what it was. I found it unmotivated. I thought, where did he get that? What did he mean? Your point is very well taken, that if you do know where he got all that, it makes more sense, and then it's easier to understand it as great art. And I don't think that minimizes it at all. But that's an important lesson that I learned from the book here. How hard was it to write, or did you just find it a joy?
Writing it, once I figured out what I was writing and the structure of the book, that it even was a biography. I worked on this book in one way or another for over 20 years. I met yoran Kazak. I discovered Little Man when I was an undergrad at Yale. I met yoran Kazak and then his family friend Judith Thurman in 2003.
Was he a chain smoker? Was he a big smoker?
Which one?
Kazak.
Yes, of many different kinds of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Figuring out what kind of book it was the hard part. I had no idea. And when I figured out that it was these 4 relationships, I could write it, but then a funny thing happened. The pandemic was happening. That wasn't funny, but that happened. And I was trying to write the book 1, Buford, and I was really struggling with it. This is when Baldwin is still in Greenwich Village. He can't find his voice as a writer. And then I was at the James Merrill House, a residency, on January 6th, the January 6th. And I was starting book 2 when Baldwin arrives in Paris and falls in love with Lucienne. And as soon as the same day that I started it, I found the voice, and it took off from there. And it's ironic because Baldwin had to move to Paris. He had, in order to find his voice as a writer. And once I found that moment, it was still incredibly difficult and laborious, but I knew what I was doing, and I was also having a lot of help from the Levy Center.
How did you do that passage you did, where all of a sudden you're like the movie Touch of Evil with that long camera shot, where you follow the hallway into the bar, and there's Baldwin, declaiming, and it's the night that he meets Lucienne. How did you think of doing it that way instead of the way I would have done it if I wrote a biography, which is they were all sitting at a table and Baldwin was talking? How did you do that camera shot? What made you think of that?
Well, I thought of it as a film. I thought, yeah, you're right. I thought of it filmically, not that I was thinking of a film at that point. But I also, Richard Olney, who it was one of his friends, the artist, had written a book called Reflections where he described that bar, La Reine Blanche. And I found those descriptions, they just brought the place alive. So I was able to quote a little bit from those to help set the scene. And then so basically what happens is it's almost like you're walking into this bar, La Reine Blanche in Paris, and it's this long, dimly lit tunnel, and you get there, and there's this woman named Madame Alice, the bar's patron, who has like a face that looks like stone, and her hair doesn't move, and she can throw you out of the bar. And then there are all these men, throngs of men smoking cigarettes, white men. It's called La Reine Blanche, the White Queen, but there was at least one non-white queen there that night. And as you're following it, you see these men are surrounding somebody on all the cigarette smoke, and then there is James Baldwin smoking a cigarette, drinking his drink, speaking in his so-so French, telling the story of the stolen bed sheet, which is the basis for his important essay, Equal in Paris. And this is the moment when he meets Lucien Happersberger, who becomes the love of his life.
And then there's the third love of his life, who is Kazak. Tell us, and I know that you're probably doing this for the 65th time, but I would not be fair to the audience to not ask you to tell us. How did you find this man? He was lost to anybody who would be interested in digging him up about Jimmy, and yet you found him.
So 1996, I'm taking a class on Baldwin at Yale. We read everything by him except this out-of-print children's book that happens to be at the Beinecke. So I go to the Beinecke, and I also read David Leeming's really important 1994 biography that had just come out, but there were only like 2 paragraphs about Yoran Kazak, and they were very elusive. They were close friends, but he became the godfather to his son, just like he became the godfather to Lucien's son. So I suspected that there was something else going on there. But I also, when I found the book, it was just such an unusual, it was a children's book for adults and an adult's book for children, illustrated by Yoran Kazak, written entirely in what Baldwin celebrated as Black English. Very, very unusual book, published in 1976. So I sent like the second email of my life to David Leeming saying, do you know anything more about Yoran Kazak? He writes me back a very nice email saying, I never met him, I don't know anybody still alive who met him, and I'm pretty sure he's deceased. So 6 years pass, I moved to New York, I'm getting my PhD at Columbia. I decide to send more emails to art historians in Paris. Do you know anything about this obscure French artist, Yoran Kazak? But he lived in Tuscany and he's dead, and left my phone number. And a few weeks later, I'm broke in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, the phone rings. It's this raspy, French accented 63-year-old man saying, this is Yoran Kazak, I'm alive, come to Paris. I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy. And he also said, but before you come, go meet my son, who's Baldwin's godson, who was living in New York at the time, and go meet this dear family friend, Judith Thurman, who's here tonight. So I distinctly remember, going up to her. I was so intimidated. I'm in my 20s. Here's this New Yorker writer, a National Book Award winner. And there I walked around the block 3 times before I could knock on the door. And then I did, and we sat down, and she just, with great narrative panache, she told me everything she knew, everything she could tell me, but she left breadcrumbs so that I would have to go over there myself and ask Yoran more questions myself, which I did.
Is he with us now?
No, so that was 2003, and then very sadly, I went over that summer in Paris and lived there. I went there a few trips, so I got to know him quite well. But then he unfortunately died in 2005.
Oh. Okay.
And then I continued to interview his wife, Beatrice, and other people. But I didn't know that I wanted to bring Little Man back into print and tell this little story about his later life that slowly, organically grew into a much bigger book over the course of 2 decades.
And that book now exists and is available from your friendly bookseller?
Yep, right here.
That's good. That's very good. No, not this book, but the
Oh,
Kazak and Baldwin
Yes,
book.
Duke University Press. They did a great job. My co-editor, Jennifer DeVere Brody of Stanford. We got Baldwin's niece and nephew, who the book is inspired by. They wrote the afterword and the foreword, and it's a beautiful book. And we're going to do an exhibition of the original illustrations from it, hopefully, in France this summer.
Oh, wow, that's wonderful. What got you into James Baldwin? As opposed to James Joyce or
I love James. I love
Wallace
James
Stevens or
I love James Joyce as well.
Not Wallace Stevens.
But I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my father was a civil rights attorney and activist, and I went to the D.C. public schools, and I was one of the few white students at that point in that school system, and I had this great teacher, Mrs. Miles, and on the walls of her classroom, she had drawings of famous Black writers, and Baldwin was one of them, and I saw his eyes, and I was immediately just taken with him. I thought that was the end of the story, but recently we reconnected, and she said, "No, Nick, then you came in a suit and gave a presentation on Baldwin's life," which I completely repressed that. But I guess I did that. So I've been writing this book for 40-some years.
Wow. What do you think of the Campbell biography of Baldwin, which I liked so much that I read it twice?
James Campbell did it, and I mean, James Campbell and David Leeming and William Weatherby and actually Fern Ekman all deserve like so much gratitude from anybody interested in Baldwin because they were doing this work. I'll start with Fern Ekman because she was like a journalist like here in New York, and she wrote this book called The Furious Passage of James Baldwin in the 60s. She followed him around everywhere, and she got him to talk unlike anybody else has ever gotten to talk. So that was incredible. Parts of that were reprinted recently in The New Yorker, thanks to Eddie Glaude. So that was an important source. And then Weatherby came out, I think, first, or was it Campbell? But Campbell did incredible research, especially on Baldwin's early years in Paris. You know, he really captured that moment in his life, and all of them who are still
Not as well as you did, and I mean it, but still, but he was a good precursor.
Yeah, and I drew on his work very much. But I went back to like Otto Friedrich, who wrote this incredible essay about Baldwin called Jimmy. Otto was his friend of his in those early years in Paris. You know, going to those kinds of sources, which I found through prior biographies. So I'd read James Campbell's biography, or I'd read David Leeming's, and I'd see where their sources were, which is why the endnotes are so important, Kai. And I would go back to the primary sources, and then I would do more with them if I could, because they were so incredible. But James Campbell, you know, he shares that idea that you do and that some people do about this bifurcation between his fiction and his nonfiction. So that book is kind of marked by that approach.
Yeah, that's true.
But you know, David Leeming's biography is not marked by that approach. David Leeming's biography is different in a way because David was his friend and personal assistant. And of course, David Leeming becomes a character almost, or he does, in my book, because he was so important to Baldwin and has been so incredibly generous to me, sharing archives, sharing stories, sort of teaching me Baldwin's philosophy of love, because David was part of that sort of that world that he was in.
I want to phrase this question in a way that won't be a repeat of what I'm sure you've been asked before. My partner is Russian, and I said that I was doing this tonight, and you know, very literate, very erudite person, didn't happen to have heard of James Baldwin. And so she said, well, honey, who is he? And I was challenged. I was thinking, what is the one-liner on him? Like if she had asked Hemingway, I know what I would have said. If she had said, who's Richard Wright? I would have two sentences and just say that. With Baldwin, I had to work at it a little because he's such a large, ambiguous, and eccentric in a positive way figure. So I said some stuff, but what would you have said?
I do believe that he is the most important writer of the 20th century. That's what I would say. That doesn't mean I think he's the best. Again, that's not my place to judge. I'm not saying anything, I'm not making any claims like that. I do think, historically, he is the most important writer of the 20th century for a whole bunch of reasons that we could talk about. But that is the line that I would say.
The most important. Give me one reason. I'm not skeptical, but just that is a bold claim.
Because he was exactly what he called himself, which was a witness. People wanted him to be a spokesman. People wanted to pigeonhole him as this, that, or the third. And he was exactly what he said. And he witnessed so much and had the facility to write about it. He witnessed the end of Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression. He witnessed the Civil Rights Movement. He witnessed the Women's Rights Movement. He witnessed gay liberation. Even if he wasn't explicitly involved in some of these, they infused his writing. He witnessed them, and he changed this country, and I hopefully still can.
You mean that he opened people's eyes to new ways of looking at things? And that he had an actual major impact on what now would be considered the default Mr. and Mrs. America perspective on race.
Yeah, if people had really listened to him, we might, we'll never know, but we might not have landed where we are now. I think that's what makes it important. I also do think he was a first-rate artist, and that stands on its own. But the fact that what he was writing about were the most pressing issues of the 20th century that are still with us, that he was still writing about in the 80s. I mean, he died too young at 63. He was still writing about androgyny before we were talking about trans identities. He was writing about in The Evidence of Things Not Seen. He was already writing about kind of what it means to have a media cycle that is saturated with images of Black suffering, which is what we have seen now through all the cell phones and the images that teenagers are inundated with. He was writing about all of this. He was starting to write about the AIDS epidemic even in his last play that he was doing. So he was never a has-been. He always actually had his finger on the pulse of what was happening because he was a witness.
What was another project that maybe he was working on at the end? Like George Gershwin was working on an opera about a Jewish figure, the Dybbuk. That's what he would have done if he hadn't died young. What do you think Baldwin's magnum opus maybe would have been if he had had another 15 years? Or was he not giving enough indication of that to say?
I don't know he had so many. He still wanted to write that triple biography of Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. He was working on this extraordinary play, The Welcome Table, which was based on his life in St. Paul de Vence, but turning himself kind of into this diva singer, aging diva singer, and a character comes to visit him to interview him who's clearly based on Skip Gates. And all these relationships that are happening are based on his own relationships. That's very clear. I don't know if that's his magnum opus. I think some people would say that Just Above My Head is his magnum opus. That's one that people have not his final novel, published in 1979.
That wasn't received very well, was it?
It wasn't. Edmund White received it very well. Margot Jefferson gave it a positive review. But you have to understand, this was 1979. This was the year when Baldwin, when he went to go on tour for this novel, 2020 was going to do a piece on him, and they have extraordinary footage in his home on the Upper West Side that he bought for his family. His mother's there, his kids are there, and he is laying it down about America. And they decide not to air it. Joseph Lovett, the late Joseph Lovett, who recently died, was a gay producer who wanted to do it. And they said to him, nobody cares about a gay black has-been. That's the same thing that Time magazine said to Skip Gates in the early 70s when he had an extraordinary interview with Baldwin and Josephine Baker. They didn't publish it. These are has-beens. So that's what they were dealing with. And that's why this narrative of his decline and the essays and the novels, blah, 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 it's very hard to ever see them clearly because it's so saturated by the zeitgeist of that moment of looking at Baldwin as a has-been. They have to be reassessed by scholars, by readers, by teachers, and I think that's happening now.
Definitely. We're at that time when we're going to open it up to questions. I'm told that the idea is that you go to the microphones on the side. And so do you have questions for Nicholas Boggs about the magnificent James Baldwin?
I want to ask the same question you asked before in a different way. In The Fire Next Time, he makes this quote where he says, "Life is more important than art. That's why art is so important." So it's in another way the same question you heard earlier on, but I would venture to say, is it the paradox that goes through all of his work, what you call idiosyncratic? But how would you explain that quote from everything you've read?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think that kind of what I was saying before, his life was art. I mean, that was his life. That's why I think he said that in part. And this is why the call to arms that he was called on to become a spokesperson for the civil rights movement was so hard for him. And it really took a lot out of him because he wanted to be in the south of France writing novels and plays. He wanted to be on Broadway directing plays. He did not want that. This was not something that he chose. He's so incredible in the spotlight, right, on television, that it's easy to think that this was his goal in life. And he did want to be famous. It's not that he didn't want to be famous, but and he wanted to be a bestseller, and he was ambitious in all those ways, but he did not want to be a spokesperson. He said he didn't like going to marches, but march he did because he understood that he had this unique opportunity. There's that famous interview where somebody says, "You grew up black, poor, and gay, like that must have been horrible," and Baldwin says, "I hit the jackpot." Because I have all these perspectives. He knew that not only did he have, those what we now call intersectionality, but he also had the facility with language and the ability to witness the world that was very, very unique.
This microphone. Here.
Yes, that's loud. Was Baldwin, how shall I put this, sort of marginalized or shunned by the civil rights leadership, however you want to define it, in the early 60s, in the way that Bayard Rustin was, and for the same reason?
People have, yes, for very similar reasons. Bayard Rustin, they were both brilliant men, black men, in different ways. Bayard Rustin, just brilliant grassroots organizer and strategist. Baldwin, brilliant writer and orator. How do you not have James Baldwin, giving a speech on the March on Washington? And it's for the reasons that we just discussed. So yeah, there was definitely talk. People, I think the Kennedys called him Martin Luther Queen. There were all kinds of reasons that he was not appropriate as the lead race man. But that actually ended up giving a lot of, once he walked away from that, and that's why the 70s and the 80s, the writing is so interesting. Because in No Name in the Street, which is a brilliant essay, where he really looks back on his life, but he also looks at the failures of the civil rights movement, he no longer had to take up that mantle, and it was very freeing for him as a writer and an artist.
Thank you for your gorgeous book. It's beautifully written, and it's also like a beautiful object, I have to say. It's really gorgeous.
Thank you.
So I have a question. I hope it's okay to ask about the craft of writing it. I'm working on a biography myself, and so I'm curious. I heard an interview with you where you were talking about you felt like you wanted to see, you were working almost like an artist, right, visually with the materials as you were working on the manuscript. So could you say a little bit more about this? Like, how did you do it? What did you do as you did that?
Yeah, when I was doing it, I was like, Nick, remember what you're doing. Remember how you're doing this so you can tell people, or just do it yourself again, but I never want to write a book like this ever again. So much like that presentation when I was in 8th grade, I've repressed the writing of this book. But what I do remember is going to artist residencies, including McDowell, where Baldwin went. And I stayed in the exact same studio that he stayed in. And it hadn't been renovated yet. So the bathroom was so tiny that I couldn't sit on the toilet. I had to go like this, but it made me remember how small Baldwin was and that he probably could. Those kinds of, I went to a lot of the places that he went, so that really helped me. There's a Corsica story that I've told a million times that I could tell, but I'll wait on that. But so first of all, I went to a lot of the places. What Bob Caro says, turn every page and go to all the places. But when I got to McDowell in my pickup truck, the other writers just brought their computers, and all the artists would show up with trucks full of all their stuff. And I don't really work digitally, so I had all of these books with me and boxes of archives. And so people thought I was a visual artist. And in a way, I'm not a visual artist, but I would storyboard the whole thing for weeks. Sometimes I wouldn't write the whole time. I'd go for a month, and I would spend the entire month taking archives out and figuring out where this letter went and just where the hell he was. The FBI files are evil, but they followed his movements really carefully, so they were incredibly useful for a biographer to know where he was flying. So it was color-coded and all these, and moving things around. And, it was kind of fun once I realized it was working, so later in the book, I was like, oh, I get to storyboard now. But in the beginning, it was sort of like mad scientist situation. Yeah.
Sir.
Gentlemen, thank you for an engrossing discussion. I'd like to ask you about Baldwin as a provocateur. William Stryon made Nat Turner gay, but I've never found any historical evidence of that. James Baldwin was his house guest at the time he was writing it. Was Baldwin responsible for Nat Turner being gay?
That is not the question I expected. But I appreciate it very much. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting Rose Styron for the first time just a few weeks ago, where she corrected somebody else's book about Baldwin, saying that Baldwin had stayed in a guest house, when in fact, she told me it wasn't a guest house, it was like a shack or something. And I was like, oh no, in my book, I also called it a guest house. But I have no idea. I know that, Baldwin was a provocateur, for sure. I have no idea. I do know, that from that documentary, Styron is in that talking about, when Baldwin was staying there, the liberals, they'd all get together around the fire, and Baldwin would say, we're going to burn your motherfucking house down. So, yes, he was a provocateur.
Thank you.
Here?
Hello. I have a question. Through a lot of the conversation, I've heard instances of talking about place and location, but I was just wondering if you can speak a little bit more how important place figures in Baldwin's and the love stories that you're telling and how that works.
Thanks for that. Yeah, place is everything. Place was everything, not just in his love stories, but in his development. So his first trip south in 1957 was utterly transformative. This was when he met Martin Luther King for the first time. This is when he'd been so outside the church, but he came back to the church and he saw that the church could be a space of not just community, but political mobilization. So it was very politically transformative for him, these different spaces that he would go to. When he went to Switzerland, that's where where Lucien took him, and he wrote Go Tell It in the Mountain, and he came up with the title. When he went to Corsica, he went there and he contemplated taking his own life, as he did several times. And he had a kind of an epiphany that he had to go back to the US and he had to get more involved. This was in 1957 as well. And he had to go south. So right before he went south. So these different places, but he wrote a letter to Engin Cazar saying his dream in life was to build a house by the side of the mountain or the edge of the sea where he could write. And he had that in Istanbul, which we haven't even talked about. Like Istanbul was, some people know this and some don't. He basically lived there for the entirety of the 1960s. He wrote there, but he also had this whole world there. He called it his home. If you count it up with the letters and everything, he would spend more than half of the 60s living in Istanbul. And he loved that city. He loved the kind of post-imperial melancholy, kind of matched his mood. So place was very important. St. Paul de Vence, when he finally created that house by the side of the mountain or the edge of the sea, that was where he was happy. But then he became so famous there that he had to run elsewhere. So he was a transatlantic commuter, truly, and so place was vertiginous for him.
Here?
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for this work. It's wonderful. I wanted you to talk about Little Man, because when that was first published, I read about it, and I've been giving it to younger people I know who are having kids as a gift, and I think that's a good idea. But it's a great book. I love the illustrations, and you revived it from not being known.
Yeah, I was part of the push to revive it. Like I said, Duke University Press, but I've written a lot of more academic pieces about it. But I had an interesting conversation recently with Michelle Norris, because one of the resources that Baldwin gave, so Yoran Kazak had never been to the US. He'd never been to Harlem. Yet here he is, this white French painter in Tuscany, painting African-American children in Harlem. So Baldwin shared with him photographs of his own family. He shared with him, he'd read out loud from his own novels, but he also gave him the Black Book, the book that Toni Morrison edited. And Michelle Norris so it's a children's book for adults and an adult's book for children. So I often say to people, they're like, I got it for my 4-year-old. I'm like, read it with them. Read it. You should read it together. And then Michelle Norris said, well, actually, the Black Book, when she was growing up, her parents read it to her, with her. And in a sense, the Black Book, I realized, is also a children's book for adults and an adult's book for children, because it's like Little Man, it's a beautiful book, but it has mature themes. It's like exploring lynchings. It's exploring like Sambo imagery, as well as, famous Black inventors. And Little Man has, as you know, alcoholism and police violence and all this stuff. So it's interesting to think of the Black Book as being the same genre as Little Man. I'd never thought of that before.
Thank you for that really stupendous conversation. So Nick, your book is organized around the theme of love. As a biographer in the process of writing, did you feel like you came to love Baldwin yourself?
You know, some people, I think one of the big differences between, say, the David Leeming's or James Campbell's biographies, which are so important that were written 30 years ago, is that they knew him. And I think they did love him. And some people now say, you know, they talk about Baldwin, they say, Jimmy this, Jimmy that. I never do that, you know. I tried to write Jimmy way early in the draft, if you remember, and it just didn't work. And I never talk about him as Jimmy. I think having a little bit of distance has actually been good for me in writing this book. So I don't know if I love him, but I know that people have often asked me, you know, do you hate him now? You've been working on this forever. It's like destroyed your life. And I definitely don't hate him. Yeah.
It's been occurring to me lately with the current political situation. Some days I wake up and think, thank God Jimmy's not here anymore, but how do you think he would be managing this backward slide that we're enduring currently?
Well, first of all, I just want to say how this is Mary Painter's niece, and Mary Painter was Baldwin's best friend, and these letters that they wrote to each other are extraordinary, and Carolyn has been so generous with me throughout this entire process.
I did get to go to St. Paul de Vence once, too. So.
Yeah, exactly. That is such a difficult question that I don't feel comfortable speaking for Baldwin, but I will say, what I said before, is that he's such an idiosyncratic thinker that that's another reason why I wouldn't prognosticate, but he was willing and able to change his mind. And I think that's something that would be helpful for people to think about in this country and the world when things are so polarized. Of course, they should change their mind to be the same as my mind, but we do need to start being willing, you know, as a world to really see each other, witness each other the way that Baldwin called on us to do, and to change our minds.
Thank you.
Nick? Thank you so much for being here. Even though this isn't my venue, this has been a great conversation. And the time has come for me to say that thank you to Shelby White and Leon Levy for your generous support of this event and institution. Thank you to this institution for allowing me to do this. And with that, may you all have a good night.